In a quiet corner of the city stood a fine restaurant known for its elegance and class. It was the kind of place where expensive perfumes filled the air and laughter from wealthy guests echoed softly through the dim lights. Every table was decorated with fresh flowers, shining glassware, and golden plates that reflected the warm glow of chandeliers above. Waiters moved gracefully from table to table, their faces polite and practiced. Among them was a young woman named Lila, who wore a simple uniform and a gentle smile that hid many unspoken stories. Every evening, Lila arrived before sunset, tying her hair neatly and putting on her apron. She was quiet, humble, and always careful with her words. She treated everyone kindly, whether it was a tired chef, a demanding guest, or a fellow worker rushing to keep up with the night's chaos. No one really noticed her much. To most people, she was just another waitress serving food and clearing plates. But behind those calm eyes and that polite smile, there was something more, something she had kept hidden from the world. When the restaurant lights went off at closing time and the streets outside grew empty, Lila would walk home through the quiet lanes, her steps soft and unhurried. Her apartment was small and a little worn out, but to her it was a place of peace. In the corner stood an old upright piano, its wood faded and one of its legs slightly cracked. It wasn't beautiful, and sometimes the keys made uneven sounds, but to Lila it was a treasure. That piano had been her closest friend since childhood. When she was little, she used to sit for hours beside her grandfather, who played gentle tunes and taught her the basics of melody. After he passed away, the piano became her memory of him. Even though life had grown harder, she never stopped playing. She had no fancy lessons, no music school background, and no audience cheering for her. Still, every night after work, she would sit on that small wooden stool and let her fingers dance across the keys. The music was her escape from the noise of the world. It carried her away from her tired body, her worries about rent, and the long hours of serving others. It made her feel alive again. Sometimes she played old classical pieces she had learned by watching videos online. Other times she created her own melodies, soft, emotional tunes that spoke of loneliness, hope, and quiet strength. No one knew about her secret. She didn't talk about it at work, and she never tried to show off her skills. For her, music wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about feeling something real when everything else around her seemed cold and rushed. At the restaurant, the customers came from rich neighborhoods. They wore expensive suits, carried designer bags, and talked about their travels and investments. Lila often overheard their conversations while pouring wine or serving food. She would listen silently to their laughter and their stories, though she never joined in. Some guests were kind, thanking her with smiles. Others treated her as if she were invisible, waving their hands without even meeting her eyes. She had learned to accept both kinds with the same quiet grace. There was a small grand piano in the restaurant, placed near the corner where live musicians sometimes performed. It was mostly used on weekends or during special dinners. Lila often paused near it during her breaks, dusting it gently or wiping its surface, pretending not to care but feeling a deep connection inside. Sometimes, when no one was watching, she would press a single key softly just to hear its clean sound. That one note always stirred something within her, like a whisper reminding her who she really was. The restaurant's head waiter once caught her doing that and laughed kindly, saying, "Careful, Lila, that piano's worth more than all our monthly salaries combined." She smiled and quickly stepped back, embarrassed, mumbling an apology. But inside she longed to sit down and play, to let the room fill with her music. Of course, that was impossible. She was a waitress, not a performer. People wouldn't take her seriously if she even tried. Life wasn't easy for her. She worked 2 jobs to cover her bills. In the mornings, she helped at a small bakery, kneading dough and packing bread. In the evenings, she served at the restaurant until late night. There were days when her feet ached so much she could barely stand, but she never complained. She had dreams, yes, but they were quiet ones, simple ones. She didn't wish for luxury or fame. She only wished for peace, and for a chance to keep playing her piano without worrying that life would take even that away. Sometimes, when she walked home after midnight, she would pass by the large concert hall across town. Its lights would still be on, and she could hear faint echoes of music from inside when famous pianists performed. Posters outside showed smiling artists in elegant clothes, their names printed in gold letters. Lila would stop for a moment, standing under the cold night sky staring at the pictures. A small smile would touch her lips, not of envy but of quiet admiration. She didn't dream of being them. She just wanted to play like that someday, not for the crowd, but for her own heart. One rainy evening, she came to work drenched after forgetting her umbrella. Her shoes squeaked on the polished floor as she hurried to change. The manager frowned at her appearance but said nothing. He knew she was hardworking. The restaurant was fully booked that night, wealthy guests celebrating a business deal. As she moved around serving dishes, she caught bits of conversation. One man was boasting about his daughter's piano talent, claiming she had been accepted into a prestigious academy. Another laughed and said, "Talent runs in good blood. Not everyone is born with class." The others nodded, raising their glasses. Lila's hands tightened slightly on the tray she carried, but she kept her face calm. Those words lingered in her mind even after the tables were cleared. When she went home that night, she sat down at her old piano, her wet clothes still clinging to her skin. She looked at her hands, rough from work, marked by tiny burns and cuts from the kitchen, and placed them on the keys. Slowly she began to play. The melody that came out was soft and sad yet powerful. Each note seemed to wash away the hurt she felt earlier. The room filled with sound, and for that moment, she wasn't a tired waitress anymore. She was just a musician pouring her heart out into the silence. As she played, her eyes closed and her breathing calmed. It was like her soul was speaking through her fingers. She didn't need applause or attention. All she needed was that connection, the feeling that through her music she could be free. Sometimes she imagined what it would feel like to play on a real stage, with lights above and people listening quietly. She imagined their faces softening, their hearts opening as the music touched them. But then she would smile to herself and shake the thought away. Life didn't work like that for people like her. Dreams like that belonged to another world. Still, every night she practiced. No matter how late she returned home, she always played before sleeping. Even when she was exhausted or heartbroken, she never skipped it. The music had become part of her breathing, part of her strength. And deep down, maybe she believed that someday, somehow, life would give her one small chance to share it. Weeks went by, and Lila continued her quiet routine, serving others by day, playing alone by night. Her coworkers liked her but never really knew her. They saw her as calm, patient, and hardworking, but no one imagined she had such a gift hidden inside. Sometimes when she smiled, there was a softness in her eyes that came from a world beyond words, a world filled with sound and emotion. She carried it quietly, like a flame she refused to let die. And somewhere deep in her heart she had a feeling that life had been listening, that maybe, just maybe, there would come a day when her music would no longer be confined to her small apartment walls. A day when the sound of her piano would reach others, not as a waitress's hobby, but as something far greater, something that could move hearts, silence laughter, and make even the proudest listener stop and feel. But for now, she remained in her corner of the restaurant, smiling softly as she refilled glasses and cleared plates, her secret still hidden behind quiet eyes. No one around her could guess that beneath that humble uniform lived a pianist whose music could one day change everything. The restaurant had never been more alive than on that particular evening. The chandeliers cast a warm golden glow across the polished floors, and the sound of laughter and clinking glasses filled every corner. Tonight was not just any night. A private gathering had been arranged, a celebration for a group of wealthy patrons who liked their nights to sparkle with elegance and charm. The air smelled faintly of roses from the carefully placed bouquets on each table, mixed with the rich aroma of roasted meats and fresh pastries that came from the kitchen. Lila moved through it all with practiced ease, balancing trays and refilling glasses, her calm presence unnoticed in the whirlwind of extravagance. The guests were dressed impeccably. Men wore tailored suits with shining cufflinks. Women had gowns that shimmered under the lights, and everyone carried themselves with a sense of confidence that bordered on arrogance. Lila had served similar people before, but there was something different about tonight. The air seemed charged, not just with wealth, but with anticipation. Somewhere between the appetizers and the first toast, the name of a famous pianist had been whispered among the guests. His reputation preceded him, a man who had performed in grand concert halls across the world, whose fingers were said to move like magic across the keys. He was expected to play that evening, and the crowd had been eagerly waiting to see him perform. As the evening progressed, Lila moved from table to table, pouring champagne and carrying platters of food. She noticed how people's conversations would pause the moment he arrived. They leaned in, their eyes gleaming with excitement, eager to catch a glimpse of someone who seemed larger than life. The pianist himself had an air of self-assurance that bordered on arrogance. He spoke little, allowing his reputation to fill the room, and when he finally approached the grand piano in the corner, a hush fell over the guests. He surveyed the instrument with a discerning eye, tapping the keys lightly and nodding as if approving it, but not without a subtle flicker of dissatisfaction. From her position near the serving station, Lila watched quietly. She had seen many performers in her life, but there was something in the way this pianist carried himself that made her stomach tighten. He was confident to the point of being dismissive, his posture straight and almost rigid, his gaze scanning the room as if measuring the worth of everyone present. The guests were mesmerized, hanging on his every gesture, their eyes reflecting admiration and expectation. Lila couldn't help but feel a mixture of curiosity and unease. She knew her own abilities, but she had never imagined herself in a setting like this, where the spotlight shone so brightly and the stakes were so high. The pianist raised his hands, and a few soft notes trickled from the piano. At first, the music was delicate and careful, precise in every detail. The guests nodded politely, impressed by the technical skill, but something felt missing. It lacked warmth, a personal touch that made music alive. Lila noticed it immediately, and for a moment she allowed herself a private thought. Music was not just about technique. It was about emotion, about reaching into hearts and making them feel. She could feel it deep inside her chest, a quiet longing to share what she knew in her own way. But then, an unexpected turn. As the pianist played, his irritation grew. He frowned at the piano, muttering under his breath about the keys being unworthy of a master and the pedals out of tune. The guests began to notice his discomfort, their polite smiles faltering. Whispers spread through the room like a soft current. Some were puzzled, others slightly amused. The pianist's pride seemed to override any thought of compromise. He finally stood up abruptly, leaving the piano silent. "This instrument is unacceptable," he announced, his voice clear enough for everyone to hear. "I cannot perform under these conditions." The announcement caused a ripple through the room. Guests murmured nervously, unsure of what would happen next. The mood shifted from excitement to tension. The celebration, which had promised beauty and music, suddenly hung in uncertainty. The manager of the restaurant moved quickly toward the piano, his face pale with worry. He whispered hurriedly to a few of the staff, searching for a solution. Lila, carrying a tray of drinks, felt her pulse quicken. She watched the pianist walk away, the guests now looking around with disappointment. The atmosphere that had been sparkling with anticipation now felt heavy and uncertain. A few minutes passed, and the manager approached the staff, looking around frantically. "We need someone to play," he said in a low voice. "Anyone, please, just to keep the evening going." He looked directly at Lila, who froze for a moment. Her heart started beating faster. She had spent years playing in secret, never for an audience, never for anyone but herself. Could she really do it? The thought terrified her and excited her at the same time. For a moment she considered saying nothing, letting someone else step forward. But when she saw the faces of the guests, their polite smiles slowly fading into impatience, something inside her shifted. Taking a deep breath, she approached the manager cautiously. I can play," she said softly. Her voice was small, almost hesitant but firm. The manager's eyes widened. "You?" he asked, clearly surprised. "But you're—" He hesitated, searching for words that wouldn't offend her. "You're a waitress," Lila nodded. "I know, but I can play. Just let me try." The manager glanced around, weighing the situation. There was no one else, and the clock was ticking. Finally, he gave a reluctant nod. "All right, just do your best," he said, stepping back with a mixture of doubt and hope. As Lila walked toward the piano, her stomach churned. Every step felt heavy, yet each one carried the weight of years of practice, of silent nights spent learning, of dreams she had never voiced. She adjusted her apron nervously and stepped onto the small platform where the piano sat. Guests whispered among themselves, some curious, others quietly laughing at the absurdity of a waitress performing in front of such an elite crowd. Lila could hear the faintest tone of mockery, but she ignored it. She focused on the keys, feeling their familiar texture under her fingertips. The old piano seemed to welcome her, and for a moment she felt a sense of calm wash over her nervousness. She took another deep breath, closed her eyes briefly, and then let her fingers fall onto the keys. The first notes were soft, hesitant, but as she found the rhythm, the music began to flow. It was not flashy or overly complex. It did not scream for attention. Instead, it carried a quiet beauty, an honesty that reached out to each listener. The melody rose and fell, gentle like a whisper but powerful in emotion. The guests who had been talking or laughing slowly stopped, their eyes turning toward the piano. Something in the room shifted. The warmth of the music filled the space, replacing tension with awe. Even the famous pianist who had been standing nearby turned his gaze toward her. His posture stiffened, and for the first time that evening he looked uncertain. The music coming from the keys was simple, yet it carried depth, passion, and an authenticity that no technical skill alone could create. Lila's heart raced, but her hands moved almost instinctively. She played what she felt, not what she thought others wanted to hear. Each note told a story, of longing, of quiet courage, of a life lived mostly unseen but rich in inner worlds. The room seemed to hold its breath, and in that moment it was as if everyone there was listening not just with their ears, but with their hearts. As the melody continued, the guests' expressions changed. The polite interest faded, replaced by amazement. Some leaned forward in their chairs, their hands resting lightly on the table as if afraid to break the spell. Others wiped away small tears they didn't even realize had fallen. Lila did not look up. She remained focused on the piano, her body swaying slightly with the music, her mind lost in the harmony she created. Time seemed to stretch, the world outside the restaurant fading into nothing. There was only the sound, only the story that flowed from her fingertips. When she finally finished, a profound silence filled the room. The notes lingered in the air, refusing to disappear. Then slowly the guests began to clap, first softly, then louder and louder until the sound filled every corner of the elegant hall. Lila opened her eyes, blinking in surprise at the overwhelming reaction. The pianist, standing a few steps behind, approached her quietly. His face showed an expression she had never seen before, not arrogance, not irritation, but awe. He extended a hand not in challenge, but in acknowledgement of something he had not expected to witness. The manager, who had doubted her just moments ago, now looked on with amazement and relief. The guests, once doubtful and impatient, were now speaking excitedly among themselves, recounting the unexpected brilliance of the waitress who had played like a master. Lila felt a warmth inside her chest, a mixture of pride, humility, and disbelief. She had stepped into a world she never thought would notice her, and in doing so, had shared a piece of herself in the most profound way. Even after the applause subsided, the energy in the room remained changed. The wealthy, the powerful, the proud, they had all been reminded that talent and beauty could come from the most unexpected places. And for Lila, the night had opened a door. It was not fame or wealth that she sought, but a chance to show, if only briefly, that her music mattered, that it could touch hearts and leave a lasting impression. And for the first time she realized that The applause had barely faded when an unexpected tension swept across the room. Lila, still seated at the piano, felt her fingers tingle from the music she had just played, but she didn't notice immediately that something was wrong. A few of the guests, who had been leaning forward with admiration moments before, were now whispering among themselves. Their expressions shifted subtly, curiosity mixed with concern. Lila's attention remained on the keys, but the atmosphere had changed in a way she could feel. The kind of silence that comes right before trouble had settled over the room. The famous pianist, who had been standing quietly in the corner, suddenly moved toward the piano with a frown. His steps were deliberate, almost measured, and he tapped a finger against the side of the instrument as if inspecting it. Lila noticed him, but her mind was still wrapped in the music she had just played. She had poured everything she knew into that melody, hoping to touch hearts, but now the pianist's scrutiny made her stomach tighten. Something in his posture suggested dissatisfaction, and she felt a quiet anxiety growing inside her. He stopped in front of the piano and raised his hands, not to play, but to point out the imperfections. "This piano," he said in a voice that carried clearly across the room, "is unworthy of a true performance. The keys are uneven, the pedals are stiff, and the sound lacks refinement." The words hit the room like a sudden gust of wind. Guests who had been marveling at Lila's performance looked around, uncertain how to react. Some exchanged awkward glances. unsure whether to agree with him or ignore his complaints. The laughter from earlier, the polite chatter, all of it seemed to vanish under the weight of his critique. The manager, standing a few feet away, felt a chill run down his spine. He hurried over, his hands raised slightly as if to calm the situation. "Sir, the piano," he began, but the pianist interrupted, his voice sharp. "I will not perform under these conditions. A true artist deserves an instrument worthy of their skill. This is unacceptable." The room seemed to freeze. Guests shifted in their seats, unsure whether to speak, while Lila's heart sank a little. Her music, which had just filled the room with warmth, suddenly felt fragile, threatened by the pianist's sudden outburst. The manager turned to the staff, panic evident in his eyes. We need someone to play," he muttered under his breath. "Anyone, please." The weight of expectation pressed down on Lila, and she felt a flutter of fear mixed with a strange, thrilling possibility. Could she do it again? Could she fill the room with music and restore the moment she had just created? Her hands shook slightly as she wiped her palms on her apron, unsure if she could find the courage. The guests, meanwhile, were growing restless. Some had come expecting entertainment from the famed pianist, and now their anticipation had turned into impatience. A few whispered about leaving early, and some shook their heads in disappointment. The grandeur of the evening, the expensive food, the sparkling glasses, all seemed diminished in that instant. Lila could feel the tension pressing on her chest, but she also felt something else, a quiet determination. This was her chance. Not to prove herself to the world, but to honor the music she loved. To let it live beyond the walls of her small apartment, beyond the hours of unnoticed practice. She took a deep breath and stepped forward. Her voice was soft, almost hesitant at first. "I can play," she said quietly. The manager turned to her in surprise, clearly unsure if he had heard correctly. But you're—" He paused, struggling for words that wouldn't offend her. "You're just a waitress." Lila nodded, her eyes steady. "Yes, I'm a waitress. But I can play. Please let me try." There was a silence that seemed to stretch on for a long moment. Guests turned to watch, curiosity flickering in their eyes. Some smiled skeptically. Others exchanged quiet whispers, and a few even shook their heads, doubtful that a simple waitress could hold a room like this. The manager hesitated, weighing his options. Time was running out, and the evening could not descend into awkwardness. Finally, he sighed and nodded reluctantly. "All right," he said. "Do your best. That's all we ask." Lila swallowed hard, feeling both fear and excitement swirl together in her chest. She walked to the piano, her apron brushing against her legs, and positioned herself on the bench. Her hands hovered above the keys, fingers trembling slightly, but inside she felt a familiar calm. The piano, worn and imperfect, welcomed her touch, and for a moment the room seemed to fade away. As her fingers pressed the keys, the first notes were tentative, small, almost hesitant. But slowly confidence grew with every chord, every melody she shaped. Her music was not loud or showy, but it had warmth, depth, and honesty. Each note seemed to tell a story, of nights spent practicing alone, of quiet dreams, of hope held tightly despite hardship. The guests, who had been whispering moments ago, fell silent. The sound of the piano began to fill the space, wrapping around each listener, pulling them into the emotion Lila carried inside her. The pianist, standing nearby, watched closely. At first his expression was skeptical, as if he were waiting for her to falter. But as the music continued, something began to change. His frown softened and his eyes widened slightly, betraying a flicker of surprise. Lila's hands moved with a grace that seemed almost effortless, though she had spent years perfecting it in the quiet of her apartment. The melody she created was not about technical perfection. It was about feeling, about reaching into hearts and leaving an impression that could not be erased. Guests who had been impatient moments ago were now leaning forward. Their faces softened, their eyes glistening. Some pressed a hand to their chest, overwhelmed by the honesty of the music. Others whispered quietly to each other, sharing amazement at the skill coming from someone they had assumed was merely a waitress. The atmosphere of tension that had settled over the room melted, replaced by awe and wonder. The music was no longer just sound. It was a bridge connecting hearts, breaking barriers of class, expectation, and doubt. As Lila played, she felt herself becoming lost in the melody. The room no longer existed as a restaurant full of wealthy guests and judgmental eyes. There was only her music flowing from her fingers and the feeling that she was finally seen. Not for her uniform, not for her role, but for her soul expressed through sound. Every chord carried her past struggles, her long hours of unseen practice, and the quiet dreams she had held close for so many years. She poured herself into the piano, letting her heart guide every note. Minutes passed like moments, and when she finally finished, the room fell into stunned silence. The final note lingered, refusing to fade, as if the air itself wanted to savor it. Then slowly applause began to rise. At first a few polite claps, then louder, stronger, until the sound filled the room like a wave. Lila opened her eyes, blinking in disbelief at the overwhelming response. Guests were on their feet, clapping, cheering, and some even wiping away tears they hadn't realized had fallen. The pianist, standing just a few steps away, approached quietly. His usual arrogance was gone, replaced by something new: respect, awe, and perhaps a touch of humility. The manager, who had doubted her just moments before, now looked on in amazement. Lila's performance had not just filled the room with music. It had shifted the energy entirely. Guests who had questioned the evening now spoke excitedly among themselves, recounting the beauty and emotional power of the music they had just heard. Some whispered that they had never experienced anything like it, and a few shook their heads in quiet disbelief that such talent could be hidden behind a simple uniform. Lila, still seated at the piano, felt a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. Her fingers tingled from the intensity of her playing, and her heart swelled with an emotion she could hardly name. She had stepped into a world she never thought would notice her, and yet, in those moments she realized that her music could touch lives beyond her small apartment. The piano, imperfect and worn, had become a vessel for her dreams, carrying them into the hearts of people she had never met. For the first time, she understood that the hours of practice, the secrecy, the quiet perseverance, all of it had prepared her for this moment. As the applause continued, the pianist finally spoke, his voice quiet but sincere. I have never heard anything like that," he said, eyes still fixed on her. "Your music, it is alive. It carries more feeling than many who have played on the grandest stages." Lila's cheeks warmed, but she remained humble, nodding slightly. She didn't seek praise, but hearing the acknowledgement of someone she had long admired made her heart swell. For once, the world seemed to recognize not just a skill, but the soul behind it. By the end of the evening, the guests left with wide smiles and lingering awe. The story of the waitress who could play like a master spread quietly through their conversations. Lila returned to her tasks, clearing tables and refilling glasses, but inside she felt changed. She had not sought attention or recognition, yet she had been seen. She had shared her secret with the world, and the world had responded with wonder rather than judgment. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine that perhaps, one day, her music could reach even farther, touching more hearts and opening doors she had never dreamed of. That night, as Lila walked home through the quiet streets, the city felt different. The lights on the buildings seemed softer, the air warmer. She replayed the restaurant had settled into an uneasy quiet after the famous pianist had refused to continue. Guests shifted in their chairs, murmuring softly, their conversations low and hesitant. Some glanced toward the staff, clearly frustrated, while others whispered to each other, their curiosity mingled with disappointment. Lila, standing near the side with a tray in her hands, felt a mixture of fear and anticipation. The air was heavy with expectation, and the tension made her heart beat faster. Every instinct told her to step back, to remain in the safety of her ordinary role, invisible and unnoticed. But another part of her, the part that lived in the quiet hours at home with her piano, pushed her forward. She watched the manager pacing behind the counter, wringing his hands nervously. "We need a solution," he muttered, speaking more to himself than anyone else. "The guests. The evening. It can't fall apart like this." His eyes flicked toward Lila, and she noticed the faintest hint of hope mixed with uncertainty. She took a deep breath, steadying herself, and then quietly, almost under her own breath, she said, I can play. I'll play." The manager froze, turning toward her with wide eyes. "You?" he said. His voice was tinged with disbelief. "But you're a waitress. This isn't—" He trailed off, gesturing vaguely toward the grand piano in the corner, and the wealthy guests now staring with mild impatience. Lila nodded firmly. I know, but I can play. Please, let me try. Just for a few minutes. The manager's face reflected the struggle of weighing risk against necessity. There was no one else, and the evening could not continue without music. Finally, after what felt like an eternity to Lila, he gave a reluctant nod. All right, just do your best, he said, his tone a mixture of doubt and hope. Lila's hands trembled slightly as she placed the tray on a nearby table. She adjusted her apron nervously and walked toward the piano, each step feeling heavier than the last. The guests were now watching more closely, curiosity flickering across their faces. Some whispered, sharing amused glances as if to say, "This will be interesting." Others simply leaned back in their chairs, folding their arms with polite skepticism. Lila felt the weight of their eyes, the room heavy with unspoken questions. Who was this girl in a uniform, daring to play in a world of grandeur? Could she possibly match the expectations of the night? She reached the piano and lifted the bench, setting it carefully in place. Her fingers hovered over the keys, shaking slightly, and she took a deep breath. She could feel her pulse thumping in her ears. Every instinct screamed to run back to the safety of being unseen, to hide behind her apron and her ordinary life. But she couldn't. Something inside her had grown too strong, a quiet courage she hadn't known she possessed until now. She had spent years learning in silence, hours and hours sitting at her old piano, playing until her fingers ached and her eyes grew tired. Those nights had taught her patience, resilience, and the joy of creating something purely for the heart. This was her chance to let that joy be seen. The room seemed to hold its breath as she lowered herself onto the bench. She brushed her fingers lightly over the keys, feeling the familiar texture beneath her fingertips. The piano was old, its wood faded, some keys slightly uneven, but to Lila it was perfect. It was a friend, a companion, and a bridge between her secret world and the one she had just stepped into. She closed her eyes for a moment, centering herself, and then pressed the first note softly, letting them spill into the room. The first sound was gentle, cautious, like the tentative steps of someone stepping into unfamiliar territory. But as her fingers found rhythm and melody, confidence grew. She didn't try to impress, didn't attempt showy flourishes or exaggerated tricks. She played from the heart, shaping each note with care, letting the emotion guide her. The music began to flow naturally, soft yet powerful, carrying a story that words could never express. Guests who had been whispering moments before now sat quietly, drawn in by the purity of the sound. The tension in the room seemed to melt, replaced by a sense of wonder and anticipation. Lila's fingers moved with a grace that seemed almost effortless. Though every note was backed by years of practice and dedication, she played melodies she had written herself, tunes that spoke of longing, quiet strength, and dreams held close. The room was filled with a warmth that went beyond the elegance of the restaurant or the wealth of its patrons. It was a sound that touched hearts, a voice without words that reached the deepest parts of those listening. Even the guests who had scoffed at the idea of a waitress playing in front of them felt their skepticism fade, replaced by awe and emotion. The famous pianist, who had been standing quietly in the corner, watched closely. His face showed a flicker of surprise, then curiosity, and finally something that looked very much like respect. He had come to the evening expecting admiration for himself, confident in his skill, and yet here was someone, an ordinary waitress, holding the room in a spell he had never anticipated. He could not look away. Every note she played was filled with feeling, every chord carefully crafted yet alive with emotion. The music was not just sound. It was presence, life, and truth. The guests were silent, absorbed in the moment. Some leaned forward, their hands resting lightly on tables, afraid to break the spell. Others closed their eyes, letting the music wash over them, carrying memories, hopes, and emotions they had long ignored. A few wiped away small tears they hadn't realized were falling, touched by the honesty in her performance. Lila's heart beat in rhythm with the music, and for the first time, she felt the true power of what she had been creating all those years in her quiet apartment. It was not about applause or recognition, it was about connection, and in that moment she felt every soul in the room connecting with her through the notes she played. Minutes passed, yet it felt like an eternity in the best way possible. Lila's melodies rose and fell, shifting from soft and gentle to strong and passionate, as if telling the story of her life, her dreams, her struggles. The music carried a weight that made the room alive, and for once everyone there, Wealthy guests, skeptical staff, even the famous pianist, was captivated by something genuine. It was a reminder that true talent does not announce itself. It whispers, it grows quietly, and when it is finally revealed, it can move mountains. When she finally finished, a profound silence followed. The room seemed suspended in awe, as if no one dared to break the moment. Then slowly the applause began. It started softly, a few polite claps, then grew louder and louder until it filled the entire space. Guests rose from their seats, cheering, clapping, some wiping tears from their eyes. Lila's hands trembled slightly as she looked up, meeting the faces around her. The reaction was overwhelming yet humbling. She had not sought recognition, but the warmth and sincerity in their eyes made her heart swell. She realized that this was what music was meant to do, to speak without words, to touch without asking, to bridge hearts across walls of doubt. The pianist stepped forward, his expression unreadable at first. Then slowly a smile appeared, small and genuine. I have never heard anything like that, he said quietly, eyes still fixed on her. Your music, it is alive. It speaks with a truth many never reach. Lila nodded, feeling a mix of pride and humility. She did not need to hear praise to know the value of what she had done, but hearing it from someone she had long admired gave her a quiet sense of validation. It was not arrogance she felt in that moment, but the quiet satisfaction of knowing her voice, her music, had been seen, truly seen. The guests lingered, reluctant to return fully to conversation. Many approached her afterward, offering kind words, asking questions, and expressing amazement. They wanted to know who she was, where she had learned to play, how she could bring such emotion through the piano. Lila answered simply, her voice soft and steady, careful to remain humble. She did not boast, did not seek attention, she simply shared what she could. Her story was not one of privilege or fame. It was one of persistence, of quiet dedication, of love for music that could not be silenced. By the end of the evening, the energy in the restaurant had transformed completely. Where there had been tension, there was now warmth. Where there had been skepticism, there was awe. The evening had been saved, not by wealth or power, but by courage, talent, and the quiet determination of a young woman who had refused to remain unseen. Lila returned to her duties, clearing tables, refilling glasses, her movements calm despite the whirlwind of emotion inside her. She had stepped into a world that rarely noticed her, and yet she had made it pause, listen, and feel. Later, as she walked home through the quiet streets, the city lights reflecting softly on the wet pavement from an earlier rain, Lila felt a calm satisfaction she had never known. Her life as a waitress had not changed in a material sense. She still had bills to pay, long hours to work. But her understanding of herself had grown. She had stepped forward, faced fear, and shared her gift with the world. And in doing so, she realized that her music was more than notes on a page. It was a voice that could reach others, a reminder that hidden talent can shine in the most unexpected places. That night, she returned to her small apartment and sat at her old piano. She did not play for anyone now. There was no audience, no applause. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the city outside. She closed her eyes and let her. As the first notes left the piano, the atmosphere in the restaurant began to shift. Guests who had been whispering, fidgeting, and exchanging uncertain glances grew quiet, their attention drawn instinctively to the music. Lila's fingers moved delicately over the keys, each note carrying warmth, emotion, and a subtle story that no words could convey. The sound was gentle at first, almost hesitant, but it soon deepened, filling the space with a richness that captivated every ear. There was something about the music that went beyond skill, something alive, something human that seemed to reach into the hearts of those listening. The wealthy guests, who had arrived with expectations of grandeur and technical brilliance, found themselves caught off guard. They had been ready to applaud the reputation of the famous pianist, to admire skill polished by fame and money. Instead, they were met with honesty, passion, and raw emotion, flowing from someone they had overlooked completely. Whispers began to fade as their eyes turned to the piano, their expressions softening, mouths slightly open in quiet astonishment. Lila had not played for them before, yet each note resonated deeply, creating a bridge between her world and theirs. Even the famous pianist, standing nearby, could not hide his reaction. At first he had been skeptical, his arms crossed and eyes sharp, prepared to judge. But as the melody unfolded, he relaxed slightly, his frown softening into curiosity. He had performed on countless stages, touched countless audiences with precise technique and grandeur. Yet he felt a stir inside him he had rarely experienced. It was not perfection he felt, nor showmanship, but authenticity, honesty, and feeling. The music spoke in a language beyond technical skill. It was life itself, expressed through a pair of hands that had known struggle, patience, and quiet perseverance. Guests shifted in their seats as Lila's hands glided across the piano. A middle-aged woman, elegantly dressed with diamonds on her wrist, leaned forward, resting her chin on her hand as if afraid to blink. She was captivated, her eyes reflecting a vulnerability she had not expected to reveal in such a formal setting. A man with silver hair, a businessman who usually spoke loudly and dominated conversations, found himself still, listening with a reverence that surprised even him. The music carried stories he could not name, memories he hadn't thought of in years, and emotions he had long buried under work and responsibility. Lila's performance had become more than notes, it had become an experience. The room transformed as the melody deepened. The soft lighting, the polished tables, and the glittering glasses seemed to fade into the background. It was as if the restaurant itself had melted away, leaving only the sound, the emotion, and the human connection that the music created. Even the staff paused in their duties, standing quietly in corners or behind counters, listening. Lila had never intended to command attention in this way, and yet she could feel the energy in the room shift, palpable and electric. Her music had the power to hold a room, to quiet doubts, to draw people together if only for a moment. Her fingers moved faster now, dancing lightly over the keys, bringing a new intensity to the melody. It was not frantic, nor was it showy. It was alive, carrying a sense of urgency that spoke of dreams deferred and opportunities quietly seized. Some guests closed their eyes, letting the music wash over them, while others sat rigid, holding their breath as if afraid to break the spell. Each note seemed to hold a story, a feeling, a part of Lila's life that had never been seen before. The contrast was remarkable. Here was a waitress unseen by most, filling the room with beauty that wealth and prestige had not produced. A young man, dressed in a tailored suit and holding a glass of champagne, whispered to his companion, "Who is she? Where did she learn to play like this?" His companion shook her head, equally astonished, replying, "I have no idea, but it's incredible. I've never heard anything like it." Their words echoed the thoughts of many in the room. Lila's talent was no longer a secret. It was undeniable. It had no need for fame or credentials, no need for introductions or titles. It simply existed, alive in her hands and in the hearts of everyone who listened. The pianist, now standing closer, could no longer hide his intrigue. His eyes followed every movement of her fingers, noting the fluidity, the confidence, the emotion. He had expected precision and flair, but what he saw instead was something far more powerful: authenticity, heart, and a depth that no reputation could convey. For the first time, he was not the center of attention. He watched silently as Lila held the room, her music commanding respect not through status but through sincerity and undeniable talent. Lila's own awareness of the audience was minimal. She was lost in the music, fully immersed in the melody and the story she wanted to tell. Each note was deliberate yet instinctive, shaped by countless hours of practice, by nights spent alone, and by a lifetime of listening to the world quietly. Her emotions poured into the keys, the loneliness she had felt as a young girl, the struggles of working long hours, the fleeting moments of joy that came with small victories. She did not play for applause. She played to be heard, to share something that words alone could not express. Minutes passed, yet it felt timeless. Every chord seemed to linger, every note carried weight, and the audience was suspended in the moment. The wealthy patrons, the staff, the pianist, they were all connected by the music, their differences dissolved in the beauty she created. A soft gasp escaped a guest as a particularly tender note rang out, and another quietly wiped a tear from her cheek. Lila's performance had become a mirror, reflecting hidden emotions and unspoken memories in those who listened. When she finally eased into the final notes, the silence that followed was deep and complete. No one moved immediately. No one breathed loudly. It was as if the world had paused, holding the echoes of her music in the air. Then slowly the first clap sounded, soft, tentative, uncertain. And then another and another until the room was filled with the sound of applause, cheers, and shouts of astonishment. Lila's eyes blinked open, taking in the scene before her. The crowd was standing now, some clapping, some whistling, some whispering in awe. Their admiration was genuine, heartfelt, and unprompted. She had done it. She had transformed a room, changed minds, and touched hearts. The pianist approached her finally, his usual air of arrogance replaced by a quiet respect. He said nothing at first, simply watching as the audience acknowledged her talent. Then when the moment felt right, he spoke softly, almost humbly. "I have never heard anything like that in my life. Your music, it carries more emotion than most who have graced the grandest stages." Lila's cheeks flushed, but she remained composed. She did not seek praise. Yet hearing these words from someone she had long admired stirred a quiet pride and validation she had never experienced. Guests continued to approach her, their expressions filled with curiosity and wonder. They asked questions politely, praising the honesty and passion in her playing. Some asked about lessons, some about inspiration, and others simply expressed amazement that such talent could come from someone who worked quietly as a waitress. Lila answered each question humbly, careful not to overstate her abilities. She did not play for recognition or fame, but she felt a warmth spread through her heart at seeing the impact her music had on those around her. By the end of the evening, the restaurant had been transformed. What had started as tension, uncertainty, and a near disappointment had become a celebration of talent, courage, and the unexpected. Lila had not only filled the room with music, but she had filled it with awe, joy, and a reminder that greatness often hides in the most unlikely places. She returned to her duties, clearing tables and refilling glasses, her movements calm, though her heart still raced from the thrill of sharing her music. Later, walking home through the quiet streets, Lila replayed the evening in her mind. The city lights reflected softly on the pavement, and the cool night air carried a sense of calm and satisfaction. She realized something profound. Talent was not defined by status, training, or recognition. It existed quietly in those who nurtured it, waiting for the right moment to shine. And sometimes all it took was courage, a willingness to step forward, and a chance to share what one had spent a lifetime perfecting in silence. When she reached her apartment, Lila returned to her old piano. She did not need to perform for anyone now. The echoes of the evening were already imprinted on the hearts of those who had heard her. She played again, letting her fingers dance across the keys in a quiet celebration of the courage she had found and the connection she had created. Each note reminded her that her life was not defined by the uniform she wore or the roles assigned to her. It was defined by the choices she made, the risks she took, and the music she shared with the world. In that quiet room, with only the soft hum of the city outside, Lila felt a sense of peace she had never known before. She realized that the evening had been more than a performance. It had been a revelation. It had shown her the power of stepping forward, of trusting one's abilities, and of allowing the world to see what had long been hidden. And for the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future where her music could reach farther, touch more lives, and open doors she had once thought closed forever. The morning after the unforgettable evening, Lila arrived at the restaurant with a quiet sense of anticipation mixed with lingering nerves. Though the night had ended hours ago, its impact lingered like a soft echo in her mind. The memory of the guests' wide-eyed astonishment, the applause, and the unexpected admiration filled her with a strange mixture of pride and humility. She walked through the familiar doors, greeted by the soft hum of staff preparing for the day. Nothing had changed outwardly. The polished tables, the aroma of fresh bread, the soft clinking of plates, but Lila felt that everything had shifted, especially in her own heart. The manager was waiting near the counter, looking both relieved and amazed. "Lila," he said, his voice softer than usual, "I need to thank you. Yesterday, you saved the evening. I don't know how to explain it. Everyone is still talking about your performance." Lila smiled faintly, trying to maintain her composure. She did not want to appear boastful. "It was nothing," she said simply, though inside she felt a warmth she had rarely experienced. Her music had been heard, appreciated, and it had changed the mood of an entire room. For someone who had spent so long unseen, this was remarkable. Even as she moved through her usual tasks, pouring coffee, serving breakfast, cleaning tables, The echoes of the night continued to follow her. Guests who had returned for lunch glanced toward her with a hint of recognition, some nodding politely, others whispering quietly to each other. Lila felt their attention, yet she remained focused on her work. She was still the same waitress they had seen before, yet something had shifted. A quiet confidence had settled within her, a reassurance that her life and her passion could coexist in ways she had never imagined. Word of her performance spread quickly beyond the restaurant. By midday, emails and messages began arriving, some from local music enthusiasts, others from patrons who had been present the night before. They wanted to know more about the woman who had played with such depth and emotion, who had transformed a room full of wealthy, skeptical guests into a space of awe and admiration. Lila read each message carefully, feeling both nervous and encouraged. Her music had touched people she had never met, and for the first time she realized the true potential of her gift. The famous pianist's response was particularly surprising. A letter had been sent through the restaurant manager, expressing his astonishment and newfound respect. "I have performed on stages around the world," he wrote, "and I have rarely encountered someone whose music speaks so clearly and powerfully. You have a gift, and I encourage you not to hide it any longer." Lila held the note in her hands, feeling the weight of his words. They were not just praise, they were validation from someone she had long admired, someone whose opinion she had respected silently for years. It was a moment of quiet triumph, a turning point that made her heart swell with both pride and humility. Despite the attention, Lila remained grounded. She continued her shifts, serving customers, taking orders, and keeping the restaurant running smoothly. But the atmosphere around her had changed. Staff members looked at her with newfound respect, and patrons began to recognize that there was more to her than her uniform suggested. For the first time, Lila felt that her dual life as a waitress and a musician was not a burden but a balance she could embrace. She no longer felt the need to hide her talent. Instead, she began to explore ways to share it more openly. The restaurant manager approached her one afternoon, his expression thoughtful. "Lila, I've been thinking," he said carefully. "We could organize small performances here, not just for special events, but occasionally, so your music reaches more people. I know you don't do this for attention, but your talent deserves to be shared." Lila paused, considering the offer. The idea of performing regularly was daunting, yet it was also exciting. She nodded slowly. "I'd like that," she said, "but only if it feels right. I want the music to remain honest, not just a spectacle." The manager smiled, understanding the balance she sought. It was a beginning, a way to step further into the world she had only touched fleetingly before. Evenings became different for her. When she played the piano, it was no longer a secret. Patrons came to listen, quietly at first and then with open admiration. Lila's music transformed the restaurant, creating moments of reflection, joy, and connection. Families lingered longer, couples held hands with soft smiles, and even the staff felt the calming influence of her melodies. Each performance was unique, a story told without words, connecting hearts and filling spaces with emotion. It was no longer about impressing anyone. It was about sharing what she loved, allowing others to experience the music as she had experienced it in her quiet practice hours. The famous pianist returned to the restaurant on one occasion, invited quietly by the manager. He observed from a distance as Lila performed, and this time, he did not interfere or judge. He watched with genuine interest, recognizing that her talent had not been a fluke, but a reflection of years of dedication and natural gift. After her performance, he approached her, offering a simple handshake and a sincere smile. "Your music has depth," he said. "It is rare to find someone who plays not just with skill but with heart. I am glad to see you embracing it." Lila thanked him quietly, feeling a sense of validation yet remaining humble. It was enough that someone who had once seemed untouchable now saw her for who she truly was. The experience brought more than recognition, it brought opportunity. A local music school invited her to conduct workshops for students, to inspire young musicians who might otherwise feel unnoticed. Lila accepted carefully, wanting to maintain the balance of her life, but she also understood the importance of sharing her story. She encouraged students to trust their instincts, to find their voices, and to nurture their gifts quietly, but persistently. Many students were surprised that a waitress could offer such guidance, yet her authenticity and experience resonated deeply. She became more than a performer. She became a mentor, a symbol of possibility. Lila's life outside the restaurant also changed subtly. She walked with a quiet confidence, no longer shrinking into shadows when others watched. Her apartment, once a private refuge, became a place of creation, where she experimented with new melodies and recorded pieces to share with a wider audience. Friends and neighbors noticed her renewed energy, and her days felt richer, filled with purpose and possibility. The music that had once been hidden behind long hours of work was now a living part of her existence, intertwined with her daily life and her interactions with others. One evening, after a particularly moving performance at the restaurant, Lila stayed behind, sitting at the piano alone. The room was silent except for the soft hum of the city outside, and she allowed herself a moment to reflect. The journey from the timid, unseen girl who had practiced alone to the woman whose music had touched hearts felt surreal. Yet she knew it had been built on small, persistent choices: the courage to practice, the decision to step forward when fear pressed on her, and the commitment to honesty in her music. Each note she played had been a step toward this moment, a revelation that talent, when nurtured and shared, could change lives. As she played softly, her thoughts drifted to the guests who had been present that first night, the ones who had underestimated her, the ones who had been frozen in awe by her music. She realized that their surprise had been a mirror, reflecting the unexpected beauty that often goes unseen in ordinary lives. Lila's performance had not only transformed the evening, it had reminded people that talent and beauty do not always come with wealth or status. They are often found in quiet, ordinary places, waiting for recognition, waiting for the courage to emerge. By the end of the night, Lila felt a calm satisfaction, unlike any she had known. She had navigated fear, uncertainty, and expectation and emerged not only visible but respected, not only heard but understood. Her journey had been more than a performance. It had been a revelation for herself, and for those who had listened. Music had become her bridge to the world, a way to connect hearts and inspire others without words. And for the first time, she allowed herself to dream openly about what the future could hold. Lila continued her work at the restaurant, but with a renewed sense of purpose. She knew that her music was no longer confined to her apartment, no longer limited to fleeting moments of courage. It had become a part of her identity, a gift she could share, a story she could tell without speaking. And while the world might never fully understand her journey, she had learned that it was not the recognition of others that mattered most. It was the courage to step forward, the willingness to be seen, and the honesty with which she expressed herself. In quiet moments, sitting at her piano, Lila felt gratitude for the chance to share her gift. She played melodies that told stories of perseverance, hope, and the beauty of unexpected opportunity. Each note was a testament to the path she had walked, the risks she had taken, and the lives she had touched, even in small ways. And though she remained a waitress, her music had elevated her beyond titles, beyond expectations, into a place where authenticity, courage, and talent spoke louder than any social status could. The restaurant, once a backdrop for ordinary work, had become a stage for her voice. Patrons and colleagues alike had witnessed her transformation, and in turn, their own